Mr. President of the Court of Cassation, President of the Institute of Strategic Studies, fellow ambassadors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, you can see, I'm the ambassador of Brazil, new ambassador of Brazil, Carlos Martin Ceglia. I arrived here at the end of January, and just after me, the virus also arrived. So I didn't have the pleasure to know most of you. I will try to catch up. We are here. I will try to be very brief and not to bore you, but we're here, we're invited to think about the post-pandemic international system and projections and expectations for a better system, restoration, restructuring, deconstruction, or a totally new system. I think that we have to be very humble. We know very little about this virus. Is there going to be a second wave? We don't know. And we should all remember that the last big pandemic humankind had to face was the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, at the end of World War I. Now, it was in 1918 that the second wave of the Spanish flu arrived. And the second wave killed more people than World War I. The second wave, the Spanish flu, killed more people than World War I altogether. Now, did the Spanish flu have an impact in restructuring or shaping the post-World War I? No, it had very little impact. What shaped post-World War I world was World War I itself and the treaties that followed it. The disastrous Versailles Treaty and a lot of others like the Sèvres Treaty and the Treaty of Lausanne that recognized the modern Turkey founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So it was not the pandemic that framed the world. Now, before the present crisis of coronavirus, this present crisis, the world was already in a deep change. Scarce 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union finished in '91. It was a time of Fukuyama's end of history, the creation of the euro, the rise of China, the rise of India. There's no dictatorship in Europe anymore. The BRICS, technological revolution that the world is witnessing, internet, social networks that are changing politics in a way that we didn't imagine. With a telephone, you can access your bank account, you can do whatever, a lot of things, you can contact people for free. A trade war between the two most important economic actors. You know, some week ago, a president of a NATO country said that NATO was experiencing brain death. We can also say, and I can only agree with the President of the National Assembly, that we can say the same thing about the Security Council of the United Nations. It's brain death. And the Security Council and the whole United Nations system was built 75 years ago. Only 51 countries founded the United Nations. The United Nations now has more than 190 countries. So the world changed so much, but not the United Nations system. It does not reflect reality anymore. And we cannot spare a crisis. We cannot waste a crisis. I remember in 2008, during the subprime crisis, I was DCM at the Brazilian Embassy in Washington, D.C. This 2008 showed that mechanisms such as the G7, idealized by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, 74, 75, to get together 7 the most rich industrialized countries in order to show the way, economically speaking, of the world. It does not reflect reality anymore. It took the 2008 crisis to show that you cannot lead economically the world without inviting China to sit down, India, Brazil. To rethink itself. You cannot leave BRICS aside. COVID, this coronavirus, might accelerate this trend, might be a catalyzer, but not a cause. But in my point of view, we can see some trends that will have to live with it in the future. The fact is that when the crisis started, we observed the resurrection of the notion of nation states. When this coronavirus started, we saw every government running for its own solution. It was not a coordinated solution, a global solution for everybody. Everyone had its solution. So the nation states resurged. And this, I think, it's something that we have to pay attention to it. Every government reacted by itself. No country entered multilateral agencies. There's a clear symptom that nation states feel that the multilateral organizations are not corresponding for their needs. This fact alone shows how the multilateral system needs an aggiornamento, not a destruction or reconstruction, in my point of view, especially because I think one thing is for sure. The world will be more multipolar, not necessarily more multilateral. And this will have grave implications in the system. This current crisis shows that inequality, Warren Buffett, he had that, used to say, when the tide goes down, you see who was swimming naked. And inequality is aggravating this coronavirus crisis. You take the example of Brazil. Who arrived with, how did the virus arrive in Brazil? The virus arrived with upper middle class people who went to spend vacations in Italy, maybe skiing in the Alps, etc. And they came back with the virus and they brought the virus to Brazil. Now, we have a very large population, very, very poor, and the virus is spreading very, very, very quickly in this kind of environment. So, and inequality, there are a lot of people who say that inequality may bring the second wave to countries that are wealthier. There will be also a consequence of the pandemic. Some say recovery in V shape, others in U shape, others in L, so a depression. But economists now I think, are explaining that it can be in K shape, meaning even further concentration of wealth, and the poor people would get even poorer. And this could be a disaster. Finally, maybe we'll have to reinvent capitalism, or at least invent a new economic system that will not only be consumer-driven. After this pandemic, we have to think about, climate change, environment. We cannot have 7 billion people with the same consumer pattern as the average United States citizen. The world cannot cope with this. There's no way. So we have to think about that. Mass tourism, you know, those 5,000 passengers cruiser boats arriving in Venice. It's impossible. So we have to try to reinvent, because we cannot tell you know, the Brazilian middle class, or rising middle class, or Chinese or Indian middle class that they cannot consume anymore, that they cannot travel anymore. So we have to be indigenous. We have to think a little bit, but it cannot be only profit-driven. You have to think about the future, and we have to reinvent the future for the well-being, not only of us, but for our children and our grandchildren. So I think I did not bore you too much. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the possibility
Thank you.
of inviting me.